So, with all these revolutions, even though there are going to be some differences, not only in message and in purpose, and outcomes, and we'll talk about all of this in the chapter coming, all of these communist revolutions are going to draw on the mystique of the French Revolution, which, of course, they will interpret as one of the very first class revolutions or one of the very first, class revolutionary activities, which doesn't really fit, but we don't necessarily have a lot of time to kind of deal with that. The French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions all look to a modernizing future and eschewed any type of nostalgia for the past. If you remember anything about the French Revolution, they saw everything about the old regime or the way France was prior to the French Revolution as something that they didn't want to continue, as something that was bad, something that they needed to do away with. And the Russian and Chinese communist revolutions are also going to have the exact same vibe. And one of the key features of all three of these revolutions, you want to put this down here next to number three. You want to put down, please, that these revolutions are forward thinking. These revolutions are forward thinking. There's nothing about these revolutions where they want to go back to the way things were. They don't like the past. They want to move forward. They want to be progressive. There are, however, some very important differences. One is that the communist revolutions were made by highly organized parties guided by a Marxist ideology. You didn't have that within the French Revolution, even though some Marxist historians will try to transplant that ideology onto the French Revolution. And like I said earlier, it just simply doesn't work. And the other big difference here is that the middle classes were amongst the victims of the communist upheavals, whereas the middle class were the chief beneficiaries of the French Revolution. And this is a big difference. So you want to go ahead and you want to put a star there by B underneath number four. Because if you remember with the French Revolution, it's really the middle class that are the major movers and shakers of this revolution, where in the Russian and Chinese revolutions, these guys end up being the ones that are literally and figuratively on the chopping block. The other thing here is that the communist revolutions are going to carry an explicit message of gender equality. One of the tried and true things about socialists as well as communists, which are further to the left, is going to be that they believe in gender equality. The whole concept of that if you're able to labor, if you're able to work, then that ability to work or that status as a worker is the more important status than gender. That what is equalizing you, what is making you equal with all of your other workers or with all the other workers, is your ability to labor, is your ability to work and to be oppressed by the system that is presented, the capitalist system. The first revolution, of course, what we're going to deal with, or that we're going to deal with, is Russia, which was a revolution in a single year. And this is something, by the way, that was very impactful for the lead up to World War II. The fact that we have a revolution that goes on within Russia in the last couple months or the last year or so of what will be World War One pulls Russia out of the war. And then, there's this big concern. There's kind of like this ominous, potential of a, worldwide or at least a European wide communist revolution is going to really be something that the fascist powers within Italy, Spain, and Germany, as well as other fascist parties in other European countries, and also the United States, are really going to play off of. The thing with the Russian Revolution and what kind of makes it so over the top is the fact that it was very, very sudden and it was very explosive. However, you want to put down here next to number one underneath capital A, you want to put, please, that there had been long-standing problems. There had been long-standing problems in many areas of Russian life. In many areas of Russian life. The thing that kind of makes the Russian Revolution, the things that kind of make the Russian Revolution so surprising is honestly, the Russian state has been hurting for quite some time. So the Europeans, in some ways, are kind of surprised, or the Western Europeans rather, are kind of surprised in some ways that this revolution didn't occur earlier. I mean, Russia's not necessarily known uh, by Western European standards as being kind of like a tier one nation. I mean, everybody and their brother knows that, these guys are really sort of kind of on the struggle bus. So the fact that this revolution hasn't happened before is kind of surprising. What also makes this revolution surprising is that it was so unbelievably explosive, even far more explosive and more rapidly paced than the French Revolution. I mean, if you remember what kind of made the French Revolution so surprising was that you have this unbelievable upheaval in a country that was at the top of the game. So in Russia, we kind of have them at the very, very bottom. But the degree of change that's going to happen and the rapidness that that change is going to happen is going to make it kind of surprising. We have these deep-seated, sorry guys, we have these deep-seated social revolutions are soon going to show the inadequacy of the provisional government. So what happens is in February, March 1917, we have a revolution occur, and the Tsar, the monarch of Russia, is going to abdicate. He goes and he gives up the throne. A provisional government steps in. A provisional government is always a government, and kind of put government almost in quotes, that is kind of doing the day-to-day stuff until there is created a true and legitimate government. The problem is that there are so many things going wrong for Russia at this time. Not only social problems, political problems, economic problems, but if you remember with World War One is an absolute disaster for Russia. So it's a complete and total like poo sandwich for these guys. And the provisional government just simply isn't equipped to deal with it. I mean, in general, they would not and could not legitimately meet the demands of the revolutionary masses. They refused to withdraw from World War One, which, by the way, you want to add here to B underneath number two in case you don't remember. You want to put down which was going badly for the Russians, which was going badly for the Russians. I mean, the Russian soldiers don't really know what they're fighting for. On average, 1 in 4, a quarter of the troops don't have guns. They might have bullets, but they don't have guns. I mean, this is just, you know, horribleness after horribleness after horribleness with the war. All of this is going to leave the opening for the rise of more radical groups because these radical groups are going to come in and they're going to say, hey, you know what? We have a solution to this problem. And the provisional government can't simply say that they have that solution. Of these more radical groups, the most effective group was the Bolsheviks, which was led by Lenin. The Bolsheviks eventually here are going to seize power in a coup in October of 1917. They're going to claim to act on behalf of the Soviets. And I want to just real quick define Soviets for you. So you want to go ahead and underline Soviets. And then right next to it here, you want to put down that Soviets are councils of workers. Soviets are councils of workers. And if you remember, these Soviets go back to the revolution in 1905, and they're still allowed to exist throughout this time period. So as soon as the Bolsheviks come in, they claim that they have legitimacy based upon these worker councils, that this is where they end up going and getting their power from. Eventually, here we get a 3-year civil war that's going to follow with the Bolsheviks versus a variety of enemies. You want to put down here next to B, because we kind of have two sides here, but you want to put down here next to B underneath number 3. Do you want to put down the Reds, as in the color Reds, slash Bolsheviks, which is spelled right there for you, versus the Whites. The Reds slash Bolsheviks versus the Whites. The problem ultimately is that the Bolsheviks have a singular idea. They have a plan. They have a common goal. They have a common enemy. Where these variety of enemies is just going to be kind of everybody that doesn't like the Bolsheviks. In some cases, they're going to be fellow Marxists. In some cases, they're going to be people that support the monarchy. They're going to be people that support democratic reform but don't like the communists or don't like Lenin. I mean, the whites are really just going to be a hodgepodge of people that can't really get their crap together enough to do anything against the Bolsheviks, to be successful against the Bolsheviks. Ultimately, in 1921, the Bolsheviks, who will rename themselves the communists, had won. And there's a couple things here that occurred during the Civil War. The Bolsheviks are going to regiment the economy. In fact, specifically, you want to put down here next to A underneath number 4, just put down war communism. They're going to commit atrocities, but then again, so did their enemies. In fact, both sides, and you want to put down here next to C underneath number 4, just put down use of terror. I guess the one good thing, if you're using terror, the Reds are using it against their enemies. The Whites are just sort of kind of using it against everybody. So you have people who would benefit from supporting the Whites, but they'll support the Reds because then at least they know that they're not going to be terrorized by both groups. They also are going to claim to defend Russia from imperialists as well as from internal exploiters. One of the other groups of the Whites, and one of the things the Bolsheviks are going to be able to do very effectively is that they're going to be able to portray the whites as kind of a tool of the Western powers. One of the very first things that Lenin will do once he gets power is to remove the Soviet Union, remove Russia from World War One. Well, the English and the French are really concerned that because Lenin and the Russians have signed this treaty with Germany, that all of a sudden, all of those weapons, all of that funding, all of that stuff that England and France has funneled to Russia so they can fight the Germans is not going to end up in German hands. And so you see a lot of French and English and British money going to the sides of the whites to kind of help the whites defeat the Bolsheviks. Well, the Bolsheviks, eventually communists, are going to be able to use that by going and saying, hey, look, these Western powers want to intervene, and they want to do what all these Western powers want to do, which is to imperialize. And they end up getting a lot of support for that. For 25 years, the Soviet Union, or USSR, was the only communist country. These guys are going to expand into Eastern Europe thanks to Soviet occupation at the end of World War II. Now, this is going to be important. And you want to put down here next to A underneath number 5, you want to put down, please, that Stalin used the losses of World War I and II to justify this claim. Stalin used the losses in World War I and II to justify this claim. At the end of World War I, just to back up here just for a second so you kind of understand the picture here. At the end of World War I, the Russians, because they signed that peace treaty with Germany, they lose a lot of territory. Like they lose this great, big, huge, massive swath of Western Russia. And because they're dealing with a revolution and a civil war, they don't participate in the Versailles Treaty. So they don't get that stuff back. They also don't really get anything in regards to the Versailles Treaty, even though until 1917, the beginning of 1918, they were on the Allied side. So they sort of kind of get screwed over. Also, if you remember from last chapter, the Soviet Union really took it on the chin for a big part of World War II, at least until the Allies were able to open up a Western front. I mean, Stalin and the Russians are kind of single-handedly barely able to hold off the German war machine. So at the end of World War II, Stalin's tanks are in Eastern Europe, and he basically goes and he tells the Western powers, "Well, we're just simply going to claim all of this as ours because we're kind of due." This fixes the situation where we get screwed over at the end of World War One, even though we were on your side, and also this is kind of payback or payment for the beating that the Nazis just gave us. Now, China is going to be in the revolution, the Communist Revolution in China, it's going to be a slightly different beast. While in Russia, it happens very, very quickly. Like, legitimately, if you want to get rid of the civil war, it happens really only in the course of a couple months, maybe stretching it out a year. Communism is going to win in China in 1949 after a long struggle. In fact, you want to put down here next to number one underneath capital B, you want to put down that the conflict was around before this. The conflict was around before this. I mean, it's been a minute since we kind of talked about China. And if you remember, like one of the last notes, we kind of foreshadowed what was going to happen. But if you remember, the Chinese imperial system collapsed in 1911. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is not going to be founded, is not going to be created until 1921. And for those 10 years, and even beyond that, the Chinese government is really going to flounder. There's going to be a lot of rollover in governments. There's not going to be a lot of political stability. So, over the next 28 years, the CCP is going to grow immensely and transform its strategy under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Now, one of the reasons why this revolution is going to be so drawn out is that they have a very formidable enemy in the Nationalist Party, which rules China after 1928. The key figure here is going to be Chiang Kai-shek. In fact, you want to put a little star here by A underneath number 3. Because Chiang Kai-shek is going to be such a formidable leader, and the Nationalist Party really does have a good and organized platform, the Communist Party is going to be driven from the city, and they have to develop a new strategy. Again, this is going to be where they take that Marxist ideology. And just like Lenin before him and Stalin before him, Mao is going to have to tweak the Marxist message to fit what he has going on within China. So what he does is that he looks to looks to the peasants for support, not the city workers. And in fact, you want to put down here next to A underneath number 4. Do you want to put down that this is a compromise of Marxist thought? This is a compromise of Marxist thought. Marx believes that it's these industrial workers, these members of the proletariat, that are going to launch the revolution. For Mao, he's taking out the city workers, the proletariat, because it doesn't have any access to them, and he's subbing in the overly oppressed peasants, and he's making them kind of like this de facto proletariat. He also goes to recruit women and makes many important reforms in the regions that they control. Like, they outlawed arranged marriages, they made divorce easier, they gave women the right to vote and to own property. Women's associations are promoted, and male reactions are going to lead to some modifications. So, again, keep in mind that the communists, or those that are further to the left, are going to be more in favor of gender equality. Now, this does not mean that this type of gender equality is going to be uniform. There will be some reaction against it, and there's also going to be some limits to those reforms that are going to take place. All of this, Mao and the communists are going to be given a boost by Japan's invasion of China. They're going to be far more effective than the Nationalist Party. And in fact, they're going to use the fact that Japan is able to come in and invade as propaganda against the nationalists. Like, look, they're in charge, but look what has happened. Where, we are this opposition to the Japanese coming in, and we're also the opposition to what's going on with the Nationalist Party here as well. And in fact, you want to put down here next to B, underneath 6, you want to put down that this destroyed the nationalist control of much of the country. This destroyed the nationalist control of much of the country. Because let's face it, how much sway are you going to be able to have if your government is the government that gets invaded and gets, utterly and totally abused by the Japanese? I mean, this causes them to lose like big time. Eventually, here, the Communist Party is going to address both foreign imperialism and also peasant exploitation. So, foreign imperialism with the Europeans coming in and kind of doing their whole, spheres of influence, like we talked about in chapter 19. But then also the peasant exploitation that has been a problem for quite some time. They also express Chinese nationalism and demand for social change. I mean, after all, they are still Marxist. And they will also gain a reputation for honesty, unlike the Nationalist Party that kind of has a cloud of corruption, to say the least. Overall, and you want to put this note underneath B here. You want to put this note right here underneath B, underneath number 7. Actually, put a star by this note. You want to put, please, here, overall, while the communist revolution in Russia, overall, while the communist revolution in Russia was relatively brief, the communist revolution in China lasted for decades. The communist revolution in China lasted for decades. I mean, we have in the 1920s, until Japan shows up, we have a throwdown between the nationalists and the communists. Japan comes in, that conflict between the nationalists and the communists, they press pause. As soon as Japan leaves, then all of a sudden it ends up being game on. And during that time of Japanese occupation, the communists and the nationalists are still, they're not necessarily going at each other or trying to duke it out, but they definitely are maneuvering to kind of outdo themselves. So this revolution definitely is going to be taking, a couple decades versus a couple years.